We are broadcasting from the Hyatt Regency here in Birmingham, Alabama at the EWTN Catholic Radio Conference. We've got affiliates and folks who work in Catholic radio literally from coast to coast. Very excited to be here with you on Call to Communion today for our live broadcast. Here is that phone number, 833-288-EWTN. That's 833-288-3986 if you have a question about the Catholic faith. You can also shoot us an email if you prefer that. The address ctc@ewtn.com. Pedro Quiles is with us here at the Hyatt Regency. He is our online producer or field producer, whatever you want to call it. Michael McCall back at the studios. Matt Kabinski handling phone screening. I'm Tom Price along with Dr. David Anders.
Tom, how are you today?
You know what? I'm doing great. How are you, my friend?
I'm doing pretty decent. I was, as you know, I was out of pocket earlier this week. I was with the National Catholic Education Association in Seattle, Washington for their leadership conference.
That must have been fun.
I had a very nice time. I really did. Great people out there. Met a lot of old friends. And but happy to be back in the saddle with you. So here we are.
Here we are, and we're waiting for your phone calls at 833-288-EWTN. If you have a question about the Catholic faith, maybe you'd like to explain to us what is stopping you from becoming a Catholic. Love to talk about that as well. 833-288-EWTN. Here's a question to lead us off. This is from Ava. Dr. Anders, my name is Ava. I'm 12 years old. Love your show. I have two questions. The first one is, what if Adam and Eve ate the apple, but they did not hide from God, and then they apologized? My second question is, why did Jesus choose to die in Jerusalem in the year AD 33? Thank you, Dr. Anders. I am your biggest fan out there. And again, that is from young Ava.
Yeah, thanks, Ava. I really appreciate the question. So the first question you ask is what we call a hypothetical. That is to say, you're asking a question about what would have happened, but not something that actually happened.
Right.
And the problem with hypotheticals is that we don't really know. We don't know with hypotheticals. All we can do is guess. But of course, we're not God. And so we don't know what God would have done. I don't know if you've ever read my favorite series of children's books in all the world, but if you're a fan of the show, you probably know I'm a big fan of the Chronicles of Narnia. And in C.S. Lewis's Chronicles of Narnia, there's a character in the story who is basically a stand-in for Jesus, and it's the lion named Aslan. And there's someone who's a stand-in for Ava. It is Lucy Pevensey, a young girl who's the heroine. And so things happen in the story, and she wants to know, well, what would have happened if we had done this other thing instead? And so she always turns to Aslan and says, well, what would have happened if I hadn't made that mistake? And his answer is, child, don't you know that no one has ever told what would have happened, but you can always find out what will happen, right? And that's kind of the situation that we're in. So I just can't answer the question because it's really literally unknowable.
Okay.
With the question, why did Jesus die in AD 33 specifically? So believe it or not, this is something that the church fathers did talk about, and in particular, a church father named Irenaeus of Lyon. He was a 2nd century church father. And what he said was, in essence, that it had to be this time, this place, because the world had to be properly prepared. So Israel had to go through its own religious and historical development. It had to have the Mosaic covenants, and it had to have the Abrahamic promise. It had to have the experience of exile and return and the expectation of vindication. All those things were preparatory to Jesus' teaching about the kingdom of God. But the Gentile world also had to go through a cultural evolution. And in particular, the culture in which Christ's message was distributed, which is the Hellenistic world, had to be prepared through the advent and dissemination of Hellenistic philosophy. And so you had to have a kind of sensibility to a universal morality, which definitely was the idea in Hellenistic philosophy, and conditioning to the people the idea of, idolatry being a really bad idea, and mythology being, not the way reality was ultimately structured. Preparation for belief in sort of a rational monotheistic God. All those elements of Hellenism made it very receptive, to the message of Christianity. And so the world had to develop culturally to the right moment for the Christian message to go out throughout the world.
A couple of great questions there from Ava. Thank you so much for those. That kicks things off. We're going to go to the phones in just a moment. Let me give you that number again, 833-288-EWTN. That's 833-288-3986. Here's a quick one now from Lindsay. Why is it that Protestantism teaches that Mary was just a normal mom that went on to have other children after Jesus, while Catholics believe that as soon as Mary conceived Jesus, she was sinless thereafter? Did she have other children after Jesus?
Okay, thanks. I really appreciate the question. So the problem with generalizing about Protestantism and saying, why does Protestantism teach? And followed by whatever you want the predicate of that sentence to be, is that there are always Protestants who hold otherwise. And the earliest Protestants did not maintain that position that you just stated, right? So early Protestants continued to maintain Mary's perpetual virginity, for example, and sometimes even her sinlessness. And they also taught the doctrine that Mary is the mother of God. And so you find a lot more traditional Catholic Marian dogma in early Protestantism. Now, my personal opinion is the reason Protestantism moved away from those doctrines is because they're Catholic. And one thing that has characterized Protestantism from the beginning is the belief that Catholicism is not just misguided but evil. And so you can find embedded, say, in the Westminster Confession and in the writings of Luther, the doctrine that the Pope is the Antichrist. Well, if the Antichrist teaches something, you might want to repudiate it.
Yeah.
And so there's a kind of knee-jerk antipathy to anything that is seen as characteristically Catholic. And I know when I was still Protestant and in the seminary, we would sometimes, debate different interpretations of a verse or a doctrine, and someone would float something, and then somebody else in the room would say, well, we can't go there because that's what the Catholics hold. And that was just a deal breaker. We can't take the Catholic position on that. That's just obvious, So I kind of think that has a lot to do with it.
Okay, very good. And thank you so much for that question. Appreciate that that was from Lindsay. Again, if you would like to send us an email for a future show, here's the address, ctc@ewtn.com, ctc@ewtn.com. In a moment here, we're going to get with Orville in Missouri, David in Maumee, Ohio, Michael in Cleveland, Ohio, Simon standing by. One line open for you at 833-288-EWTN. That's 833-288-3986. It's called a communion on EWTN.
Follow EWTN Global Catholic Radio on Facebook for daily Mass, spiritual talks, and inspiring content. Join our community of believers today.
This is a Did You Know moment with Sandra McDevitt. Did you know the world's largest rosary collection is housed in a small museum outside Portland, Oregon? The collection of over 4,000 rosaries was the work of a Catholic convert, Donald Brown. When people heard he was collecting, he was sent rosaries from all over the world. He eventually donated the collection to the Columbia Gorge Museum outside Portland. Rosaries include ones from Father Flanagan of Boys Town, Robert Kennedy, even a handmade one made by the Fatima visionary Sister Lucia. Mr. Brown especially treasured the one from President John F. Kennedy. It was a wooden rosary used by him during World War II when he fought in the Pacific. Since October is the month of the Holy Rosary, a fitting Did You Know? I'm Sandra McDevitt for EWTN Radio.
Stay tuned for more Call to Communion with Dr. David Anders, live from the EWTN Catholic Radio Conference 2024 on EWTN Radio.
24/7 Catholic Radio, this is EWTN.
To Call to Communion with Dr. David Anders, live from the EWTN Catholic Radio Conference 2024 on EWTN Radio.
Very glad to be with you for Call to Communion here from the EWTN Catholic Radio Conference. Our phone number, 833-288-EWTN. That's 833-288-3986. We're going to get to the phones in just a second here. Do you know the legend of the ladybug? This is a pious legend from the Middle Ages that tells of villagers who gathered to pray to Our Lady, asking for her intercession to save their crops from a sudden plague of aphids. And then suddenly, Swarms of bright red beetles appeared and ate the aphids, saving the crops from destruction. You ever heard of this, David?
Our Lady's bugs, they're called.
Exactly.
Yes.
In Thanksgiving, the villagers named the strange beetles Our Lady's bugs so that they would always remember her intercession for them. And you too can honor the legend with the Legend of the Ladybug Rosary. It is made of ladybug beads. It has a miraculous metal centerpiece and a 2-inch crucifix. It'll arrive boxed with a brief explanation of the ladybug legend. You know what? This would make a fantastic Christmas gift. Check it out by going to EWTNRC.com. I would suggest put the word ladybug in the search box there. Now, you'll probably see a picture of it right there. EWTNRC.com. Very cool. All right, if you're ready now, let's go to the phones at 833-288-EWTN, beginning with Orville in Missouri, listening on the Great Covenant Network. Orville, what's on your mind today, sir? Orville,
Hello?
Are you there? Hey, go right ahead, Orville.
Yes. Am I on?
Yes, you are. Go right ahead.
Okay, thank you. I want to know, I received the body of Christ, and the blood of Christ, the risen Lord Jesus. I firmly believe that. But at the Last Supper, they did not have to reach Jesus, who was not yet risen from the dead. What did they receive?
What a magnificent question. I'm going to repeat it for the sake of the audience. The question was, when the disciples received the Eucharist in the upper room on Holy Thursday, what was in the elements? Given that Christ had not yet died and risen from the dead, what in fact happened to the elements when Christ pronounced the words of institution? I love this question because it underlies a really central truth about the nature of the real presence. You know, Catholics believe that Christ is really and substantially present in the Eucharist, but some Catholics themselves don't know how specific that teaching is. They know, well, Jesus is really there, but they don't know the realism. They don't really fully appreciate the realism, because the Catholic position is that Jesus is not there in a merely abstract kind of way or a kind of general diffuse way. It is the very same substance of Christ that is at present at the right hand of the Father. And so if I could, obviously this is a silly illustration, but like, you know, if Jesus were to scratch his nose right now, all right, it would be the very same Jesus who was scratching his nose. Like in that instant, if you follow what I'm saying. If he were to take 2 steps to the left, it would be the Jesus who took 2 steps to the left that was in the Eucharist. However he is in his proper person at this moment, that is what is, the substance of that is what's made present in the Eucharist. So St. Thomas Aquinas captures this in a beautiful hypothetical. This didn't happen, of course, but Thomas poses this to get at the same idea. He says, if the apostles had celebrated Mass when Christ was in the tomb, now they did not, but if they had, what you would have had in the elements is the body, blood, and divinity of Christ, but not his human soul. Now, why wouldn't you have had his human soul? Because in that moment, his human soul had descended to Hades, to the dead. And the separation of soul and body is what death means, right? So you would have had, because it's properly the sacrament of body and blood, you would have had body, blood, and divinity, but you wouldn't have had soul. So applying that logic, we conclude, what did the disciples receive when they received the Eucharist in the upper room on Holy Thursday? And what sacred tradition tells us is that they would have had the body, blood, soul, and divinity of Jesus, the very same body, blood, soul, and divinity of Jesus that was seated at table with them. And so St. Augustine, commenting on this text, puts it this way. He says of Christ, when Christ took the host in his hands, he said, he held himself in his own hands. So they received the substantial presence of Christ's body and blood, but it was the substantial presence of the Christ who was with them at table in that moment.
There you go. Orville, great question. Thanks for kicking us off today. And that opens up a line for you right now at 833-288-EWTN. If you have a question for Dr. David Anders, 833-288-3986. Call to Communion, coming to you live from the EWTN Catholic Radio Conference here at the Hyatt Regency in Birmingham. Back to it for Michael in Cleveland, listening on AM 1260, The Rock. Hey, Michael, what's on your mind today, sir?
Hello?
Hey, Michael.
Yes. I have a question for Doctor. Question is, we hear that Christ is truth. Jesus Christ is our truth. And yet in philosophy, traditional philosophy, we were taught that truth is the correspondence between what is real and what is in our mind. I'm confused every time I hear that Christ is truth. What does that mean?
I love this question. This is a magnificent question. It will be lots of fun to answer, so thank you for asking it. So when you talk about correspondence, you are talking about not just a particular piece of propositional content, right? But you're talking about a relationship between the knower and the known, right? That's what correspondence means. So it's a mode of being, right? The disposition of having your conceptions aligned with reality is to be ordered towards reality in a particular way, right? So you wouldn't actually say, for example, that an inert computer that doesn't have self-awareness knows the truth. Now, we might learn some truth from a computer database, but the computer itself does not know truth. Right?
Okay.
It reflects a human algorithm that's been programmed into it. But humans are actually ordered towards reality intentionally as they know truth. Now, I want to point something out to you about the person and teaching of Jesus that is surprising, although obvious. And that is that in Matthew, Mark, and Luke, the so-called synoptic gospels, Jesus never once says that God loves us. And you say, Anders, you're out of your head. Isn't that the central teaching of Christ, that God's love for us? Well, I didn't deny that. I'm just telling you that he never explicitly says the words, God loves you. Nor does he ever say the words, I love you. So how then is Jesus' message one of love? Well, what he does do is he exhorts us to love others. So the message of love that comes through in the synoptic gospels, Matthew, Mark, and Luke, is you have to love your neighbor. You have to love your enemy. You have to love all these people, right? And if you love the poor, the marginalized, the outcast, the sinner, as God does, then you come to know God. You know God not simply as a focal object that you can grasp in some kind of discursive language. You know God in participating in God's own act of loving. You follow me? It's an orientation towards reality that you now share with God. Think about it. Here's an analogy. How do you know gravity? We don't know gravity as an object, right? I can't, here's gravity. I'm going to put it in a bag and carry it with me. No. You know gravity by participating in gravity, like by having mass. You know the experience of what it's like to be stuck to the ground. You know it in a participatory way rather than in a propositional way. And in the same way, I think Jesus' teaching is that we know God best, not when we simply understand some concept about God, but when we come to share God's character and orientation towards reality, namely that of mercy and love. Thomas à Kempis, who wrote the famous Imitation of Christ, once said, "What good does it do you if you can discuss the Trinity in a learned fashion, give a definition of the Trinity, if you are lacking in humility and therefore displeasing to the Trinity?" Like, the best knowledge of the Holy Trinity is to be the humble, self-effacing, self-giving, loving person that the Trinity is. You know the Trinity better through your orientation towards reality and the love of neighbor than you do from a philosophical definition. And so with that understanding, if you get the distinction I'm making between a participatory knowledge on the one hand and a merely abstract propositional knowledge on the other, it is through Christ that we come to be properly ordered towards reality, both in love and in our receptivity to what really is, right? That we take the veil from our own eye. We are all our illusions and self-deception and self-conceit are unmasked for us in Jesus. So as he's peeling away layers of our own self-deception and self-destructive habits and our own hard-hearted resistance to opening up to the good that is another person. As we're letting these transformative things happen to us under the domain, under the discipline of the sacraments and the operation of grace, we're becoming more and more deeply connected to reality as it really is and as God sees it. We're entering in a more participatory way into the knowledge of God, and thus our relationship with Christ does orient us properly towards reality in a relationship that could very reasonably be called truth.
Okay. Is that helpful for you, Michael?
Thank you. That's helpful.
All right, very good. Thanks so much for your call. Call to communion here on EWTN. Our phone number, actually, let me actually not give out the phone number since we're pretty much sold out. But
okay.
when a line does become available, 833-288-EWTN. All right, let's go to John in Vancouver, Washington today. Hey, John, what's on your mind?
Hi, I'm a cradle Catholic who is now celebrating on this very day the 81st anniversary of my baptism. So on October 17, 1943, I was baptized, and to celebrate it, Jesus has arranged for a full moon, which I love.
Beautiful.
Okay, so the question is, the word christening. I grew up on the East Coast in a semi-ethnic family. My dad was a Greek immigrant and originally Orthodox, but married my mother and became a Catholic, but still had, one half of the family involved in Greek Orthodoxy, and we would go to celebrations and funerals and weddings and everything on both sides of the family. And they seem to use the word christening more often than us. On the other hand, I've heard regular straight Catholics, whatever you want to call us, American Catholics, using that term. Is it interchangeable with the word baptism? Is it kosher for us Catholics to say, I was christened on October 17, 1943, or am I borrowing something from another faith tradition?
No, thank you so much. I really appreciate the question. No, that's a perfectly appropriate thing to say. So St. Paul writes in the book of Galatians, he says, whoever has been baptized has clothed himself with Christ. That becoming Catholic is to become another Christ. It's to put on Christ. St. Paul says, Christ in you, the hope of glory. So our baptism is how we enter into relationship with him. We are, if I might coin a phrase, we are Christified through our baptism. We're joined to him. We become a member of his body. And so hence the language of christening, is synonymous with being made a Christian, being made a member of Christ, being made another Christ, having Christ come to dwell within us. All of these things are affected in us by baptism. And so these terms are equivalent terms. Now, in antiquity, they used another term as well. We find it, for example, in the writings of Justin Martyr. It was common to refer to baptism as illumination, because the thought was that the person who is baptized comes to have the mind of Christ. And so a transformation in your consciousness is what illumination means.
Oh, wow.
And so they would speak of baptism, christening, sometimes illumination. Lots of new birth, lots of different words have been used in the tradition for baptism.
So it's okay. Christening is okay.
It is perfectly kosher, to quote John.
John, is that helpful for you, John?
Yes, and the first thing I thought of when you mentioned the term illumination was the light of the world,
You
the
betcha.
light of Christ.
You betcha.
Yeah,
and that's why at
so,
Easter Vigil we pass out candles and say, here, receive the light of Christ.
There you go. John, thanks so much for your call today. It is, Call to Communion, coming to you live from the EWTN Catholic Radio Conference 2024 from the Hyatt Regency here in Birmingham, Alabama. A lot of our affiliates are on the scene today. We've got folks here from Covenant Network in the Midwest, and certainly Real Presence Radio in the upper Midwest, folks here from Guadalupe Network based in Texas, really all over the country, including right here in Alabama. So it's good to have everybody here, and it's a little bit like a family reunion, isn't it, David?
Always.
Always a lot of fun. In a moment, we're going to be getting back to the phones here for Gene. We'll be talking with Gene in Miami, also John in Wisconsin, Paul in Youngstown, Ohio. Richard is standing by in North Dakota. We're going to get to all those calls. And now we have a couple lines open right now at 833-288-EWTN. 833-288-EWTN. That's 833-288-3986. If you would rather send us an email, perhaps for a future show, since we can't get those emails right now, but go ahead and send those to ctc@EWTN.com, ctc@EWTN.com. We also have a YouTube question standing by from Sean watching us, and we'll get to that in the next half hour of the program. Again, our phone number, 833-288-EWTN. It's called to Communion Live from the Catholic Radio Conference here at the Hyatt Regency in Birmingham. Do stay with us.
This week, checking in with Adventures in Imperfect Living.
I've started adding to my little morning prayer routine, going through all the things I have to be thankful about, and it's the best exercise in the entire world.
And we're getting honest to God.
I've heard you say many times how our house has become almost like a monastery at times.
I'm X McKay, inviting you to join me for Catholics Coast to Coast this Saturday at 2 p.m. Eastern and Sunday, 6 p.m. Eastern on EWTN Radio.
Hi, we're Greg and Jennifer Willits, founders of RosaryArmy.com.
Whether it's Advent, Christmas, Lent, Easter, or ordinary time, an excellent way to deepen your spiritual life is through the Rosary.
Whatever the season, praying the Rosary is a powerful way to meditate on the life of Jesus and Mary and to grow closer to them.
The Rosary helps us to contemplate the mysteries of our salvation and unites us to the life of Jesus and Mary.
Of all the tools in your spiritual toolbox, the Rosary is one of the best for building a solid spiritual foundation.
Join us at RosaryArmy.com to learn more about the benefits of praying the Rosary every day and how you can make it a part of your daily spiritual practice.
Remember, the Rosary is not just a prayer. It's a path to deeper spiritual understanding and closer union with Jesus and Mary. Find out more at RosaryArmy.com.
And you can listen to our shows, Adventures in Imperfect Living, and more at RosaryArmy.com and wherever you find your favorite podcasts.
There's more Call to Communion with Dr. David Anders, live from the EWTN Catholic Radio Conference 2024 on EWTN Radio.
Broadcasting the way, the truth, and the life. This is EWTN.
Tomorrow on More to Life, the life you were meant to live.
We'll look at how the theology of the body can help you live a more abundant life.
That's tomorrow on More to Life, 10 a.m. Eastern, 9 Central on EWTN Radio.
Now back to Call to Communion with Dr. David Anders.
Call to Communion with Dr. David Anders is live from the EWTN Catholic Radio Conference 2024 on EWTN Radio.
Very glad you could be with us for this special edition of Call to Communion. As he says, coming to you from the Hyatt Regency, it's the EWTN Catholic Radio Conference. A lot of the folks are, it's like I say, almost like a reunion. Let's get back to the phones in just a moment here. Let me tell you this first. Please join us tonight for a special edition of The World Over. Raymond Arroyo will be talking with presidential candidate, former President Donald Trump, and that'll be at a special time tonight, 10 p.m. Eastern on EWTN Radio and Television. A special time for The World Over, 10 p.m. Eastern, only on EWTN. Should be a great interview. Looking forward to that. Here is Paul now in Youngstown, Ohio, listening on the great Living Bread Radio. Hello, Paul. What's on your mind today, sir?
Hello.
Hi, Paul.
I had called a month ago with this question, but I'm not sure it got through because when I turned on the radio to listen, I heard Terry Barber and Bishop Strickland. And my question was about Barlam and Gregory Palamas and their dispute over essence and energies, and I wondered what that was about.
Yeah, thank you. I really appreciate the question. So Christian theological tradition, whether you are talking about the Catholic West or the Greek East or the Byzantine East, are agreed that the essence of God escapes us, that we don't have any immediate knowledge or access to the essence of God. St. Thomas Aquinas says about God that we know that God is, but not what God is. We don't know what sort he is. And of course, there'd be no way for us to. There's no way that we could form a clear concept of the essence of God. But but we have intimations of God from his works, from the creation. And so we have knowledge of God, and a clear knowledge of God, a clear and distinct knowledge that God is, and we can draw some negative conclusions about what God's not. And they agree on those elements, okay? But where the East and West have typically differed is how then do we conceptualize properly the relationship of God's works to God's essence? And in the West, the typical approach is to say something like this, that if we can infer the existence of God from his works, both in creation and redemption, but when we predicate of God, the best we can do is to speak analogies, and that our participation in God as creatures and as the redeemed is always, well, it's mediated through created forms. And so even grace in the Latin theological tradition is participation in the divine nature in a created manner. Now, in the East, in the Orthodox tradition, they get kind of wheezy in the stomach when you say things like, we participate in the divine essence in a created manner. Because they say, well, if what you're participating in is in a created manner, if it's a creature, then it's not God. And to venerate it or worship it as God would be a form of idolatry. And so we want to maintain, we in the East, we Orthodox Christians, that Christians have a real participation in God, yet without obscuring the fact that the essence of God is somehow unattainable. And so how do you do that? Like, how can you, on the one hand, claim that the Christian, the believer, the redeemed person really experiences a penetration and a filling with God himself, a real share in the divine nature, as St. Peter says, and yet one that recognizes the ineffability and, in some sense, the radical distance of God from creatures. And so they describe that relationship in terms of what they call the essence and the energies, so that the essence of God is something that you can't touch, can't know, can't see, can't experience directly, but that God's active work in redemption, in creation and redemption, is expressed through something called his energies. And it has spiritual and ethical consequences in the East because, and this is where Palamos comes in, that they develop a form of mysticism that is based on the idea that one can have a real participation in the energies of God. And that, iconographically and exegetically, it's associated with the light that is experienced on Mount Tabor when the disciples ascend the Mount of Transfiguration with Christ and they see him illuminated. And that becomes the picture of what the mystic is trying to accomplish through his meditative exercises, is to see the uncreated light of God. Of course, it's the energies of God, not his essence. Mm-hmm. And light here, not the kind of light that's seen with human eyes, but the light that's seen by the illumined intellect, the soul, the nous, to use Greek language, that comes to participate in the Godhead. And so that's really central to Orthodox spirituality post Palamos. And it's been a kind of a point of contention between Palamites and Thomists, although the papacy's attitude is that both of these traditions play a role in the larger Christian intellectual culture, and obviously there are Byzantine Catholics who hold with Palamos and to that Byzantine mystical tradition. And so you can be Catholic and hold that, even though it's not the predominant way it's conceived of in the West.
Paul, thank you so much for your call from Youngstown. Appreciate that. Call to Communion here on EWTN, coming to you live from the EWTN Radio Conference 2024 here at the Hyatt Regency in Birmingham. Not too active at the moment, right, David? Because everybody is in seminars and breakout sessions, so it's just kind of us.
Well, it's kind of like a beehive, all the activities going on the inside where they make the honey.
That's exactly right.
It'll come bursting out later when the doors open.
Exactly. Here is Richard now in North Dakota, listening on the great Real Presence Radio. Richard, what's on your mind today, sir?
Yes, hello, Dr. Anders. I wanted to ask a follow-up related to a question that was on the recorded edition yesterday. A lady was having difficulties consuming the body of Jesus because of her intolerance to gluten. And you talked about the source in the summit, of course, is the sacrifice of the Mass, the holy sacrifice of the Mass. But if we do not consume Jesus' body and blood at some point in our life, I guess maybe you can just speak to that. How are we able to have eternal life given that we can't consume?
Okay, thanks. So just as a practical matter, the Latin Church permits people to commune in one kind through the chalice. And so if a person absolutely could not consume the sacred host, they could in fact consume from the chalice, and in doing so they would consume the substance of Christ's body and blood, and thus fulfill the Lord's admonition to eat his flesh and drink his blood. So it does not actually have to be the consecrated host. It can be the consecrated chalice as well. But to the question, could a person be saved without ever physically partaking of the Eucharist? The answer is yes, of course. Every Old Testament saint that's in heaven made it to heaven without ever consuming the consecrated body of Christ. Every saint who makes it to heaven after the ascension of Jesus but is sanctified by God's grace, but invincibly ignorant of the truth of the Catholic faith, would make it to heaven without the benefit of the Eucharist. Every child who dies before their first Holy Communion in the Latin Church, who dies in the state of grace, makes it to heaven without the benefit of actually physically receiving the sacrament.
And there you go. Appreciate that, Richard. I'm glad that you're calling in, listening to the great Real Presence Radio. Let's go now to Dwayne. Dwayne is in St. Louis, listening on Covenant Radio. Hi, Dwayne. What's on your mind today, sir?
Hello?
Hi. Go right ahead.
Okay. Yes. So my question is, has to do with heresy. When you look at Calvin and Luther during the Reformation, their belief in the Catholic faith would be considered heresies, correct? How come those heresies were able to grow into churches versus the earlier heresies that St. Augustine and St. Dominic had to deal with, like the Manichaeans and the Albigensians?
Okay, thanks.
How was the church able? Was the way the church dealt with them in those early years more efficacious?
Okay.
All right, right. Yeah, I'm totally with you. I appreciate the question. So a number of qualifications before we get into the meat of the question. The first one is, you framed a rhetorical question. Those things are heresies, right? And then you moved on. That's not the way the church speaks about Protestantism today, and very, very good reasons for that. In fact, the Second Vatican Council prefers to refer to Protestants as our separated brethren. And technically speaking, heresy is a canonical crime of obstinately denying what the church declares to be a dogmatic truth. And so I'm a practicing Catholic. I am literally a card-carrying Roman Catholic, right? I mean, I've got the card, right?
Yes, you do.
And if I personally, like David Anders, if I were to get on the radio and present myself as a Catholic in obedience to the Pope and the Bishop, and yet say, and oh, by the way, I deny the dogma of justification as taught by the Council of Trent, and I instead affirm the doctrine of free imputation through faith alone in Christ's imputed righteousness. So I took a position that I knew to be at odds with the dogmatic teaching of the Church, and to obstinately proclaim that in the face of, say, my bishop's rebuke, then I would be guilty of the canonical crime of heresy. But when my Baptist neighbor believes this through no fault of his own, because it is what he has been conditioned to believe from childhood, and he has no exposure to the Catholic faith and no reason to take it seriously, then he's not technically guilty of the crime of heresy, because he's not doing it obstinately in the knowledge that the Church, as the authority founded by Jesus, teaches otherwise, right? So it's Luther was different, because Luther, of course, was a Catholic priest. My Baptist neighbor is not a Catholic priest in the same sense, and so I wouldn't call him a heretic. I would call him someone with whom I share elements of truth and sanctification, but there's things that are deficient about his belief system. But he's a brother in Jesus.
Oh, very good.
And so just on the heresy business, right?
Okay.
But to the substance of the question, why was the church seemingly more effective at eliminating other ancient heresies? Well, I'm not so sure it was that effective in this sense. It was effective in defining them as heresies. And so the history of, say, the Christological doctrines of the first 4 centuries is very clear that, okay, here is the Orthodox Catholic position on the Trinity, on the two natures of Jesus, on the doctrine of Mary's divine maternity. All these Christological questions have been clearly defined. It's not like people stopped being dissenters from the Catholic point of view. So we still find Arians today.
Yeah.
We still find Nestorians today. We still find Monophysites today. We still find quasi-Albigensians today. Various Gnosticisms and dualistic and Manichaean heresies continue to exist and thrive in the world today. So what the church does is it says, this is the wrong position. That doesn't mean that everybody's going to stop holding it, okay? Now, in terms of the organizational success of Protestantism as opposed to, say, medieval French Albigensianism, well, one thing that the church did with Albigensianism that, I don't think we would endorse today at all is that they held a crusade against it and they went in, got rid of a lot of people politically, right? So that's, that unfortunately that can be an effective means of suppressing heresy. We don't want to do that. But the Reformation was more than just a doctrinal movement. There's a great deal more involved in the Reformation than Luther articulating an idiosyncratic position on the sacraments and salvation. The Reformation was a multifaceted, complex social movement that penetrated European society at the intellectual, the cultural, the demographic, the political, the economic levels, and of course swept whole countries into its orbit. And so, England became a Protestant country. Elements of Germany, princely dominions in Germany became Protestant. Scandinavia became Protestant. City-states, as it were, within the Kingdom of France became Protestant until the wars of religion sort of suppressed that. And so, the Netherlands. And so it had a kind of institutional and cultural support behind it. And Protestantism rode on the waves of social discontent with the status quo economically and politically. It benefited from the advent of the printing press, new technologies, new social forms. It was just a very deeply complex movement. And what the church did effectively was define the things that were wrong about its doctrinal position. But how do you, if you're the Pope in Rome and there are no Catholic monarchs that can effectively go to war with Henry VIII and reconquer the country. They tried that approach, right? Queen Mary attempted it, and then the Spanish Armada failed, right? What are you going to do except send missionaries, which Queen Elizabeth tortured to death?
Yeah.
We did our darndest.
Yep, sure did. Dwayne, thank you so much for your call from St. Louis. Call to Communion here on EWTN. We're going to try to get to as many calls as we can, and hopefully the questions via YouTube and all that. Right now, here is John in Wisconsin, listening on Sirius XM, Channel 130. John, what's on your mind today, sir? John in Wisconsin, are you there? Okay, why don't we put him on hold then, Michael, and we'll go to Clay. Clay is a first-time caller in Kansas, and Clay is listening on the great Divine Mercy Radio. Hello, Clay. What's on your mind today?
Yes, can you hear me?
Yes, go right ahead, Clay.
Hey, I appreciate taking my call. I was calling in regards to the qualifications for bishop, and I was curious how and when. I don't come from a Catholic background. My family has some Catholic influence. Both my in-laws came out of the Catholic Church. But I was curious why the ban on marriage for bishops when it seems Paul was pretty clear in his qualification to Titus and Timothy that a bishop could or should be the husband of one wife? I was just curious about the church's authority to change that.
Yeah, great. Absolutely. So we absolutely did not change Paul's teaching whatsoever at all, not one iota. In fact, Paul's teaching is the canon law of the Catholic Church. And so what Paul says is that the bishop should be the husband of but one wife, and that he should manage his own household well. And so we have Catholic clergy who have been the husband of but one wife, and who have managed their households well and gone on subsequently to be ordained in the Catholic Church. And that continues to be the Catholic position. And so there's absolutely no mandate that says that no married man can ever become a priest. In fact, we have lots of people who were married men who have become priests. What the church does teach is that priests can't get married.
Okay.
So there's a very big difference between a married man can become a priest, but a priest can't become a married man. Once you're married, once you're a priest, you cannot subsequently validly contract the sacrament of matrimony. And if, for example, you were a married man and you divorced your wife and married a second one, and then you divorced her and married a third, and you divorced her and married a fourth, and so you were the husband of, say, like 6 wives, well, according to the teaching of the Catholic Church, you would not be bishop material. But if you were married once and you did a good job of it, you could potentially be ordained. Now, the Scriptures have a strong preference for an unmarried clergy. And I mean, Paul's explicit about that. He says it's much better if you can do the thing like I'm doing it and I don't have a wife. And Jesus, of course, who is the great high priest and model of all priesthood, is, of course, celibate and comes not to do his own will, but the will of him who sent him, and he has not a place to lay his head and all that kind of business. And so, if you're saying, well, what's the ideal form of life for someone in the clerical state, it would be to do what Scripture says is the ideal, namely, don't take a wife. If you can, don't pick your bishops and your priests from married people. But we don't have an absolute ban on married people becoming priests. In fact, I know married priests.
Me too. There you go. Is that helpful for you, Clay?
That's an important point to clarify. And I was also curious, so like right now, currently, if there's friends of mine that are Catholic, but for example, they're politically conservative, and some of them are now drifting away from the church because they don't like what they perceive to be papal political correctness. So, I mean, is it right for Catholic people to pray for the Pope that he...
Okay, thanks. So hold it right there. Okay, I got your question. Let me answer, okay? So, first of all Catholics should pray for the Pope.
Yes.
On a daily basis, right? The Pope is a human being, and even though we hold that under very, very limited and strictly defined conditions that he can be infallible, and they're very strict conditions under which that particular charism holds, in the day-to-day conduct of his life and his teaching, the Pope is a mere man who holds a very important office. He's a mere man holding not a mere office. And no one's up for that job. Like, it is totally not up when nobody is capable of being the Pope because the weight on your shoulders is astronomically high. And popes are human beings, and they're subject to foibles and misjudgments and prejudices and ideological possession. And
like the rest of us.
Like the rest of us are, exactly. And so it's absolutely conceivable that a pope could be, say, personally possessed of some radical ideology and then turn around and seek to impose it on the whole church, whether that ideology be conservative or liberal or progressive or not progressive or you name it, right? I mean, he could be some sort of medieval royalist. I mean, it doesn't matter. I mean, we've had plenty of popes through history that have taken, crazy political positions or economic positions or what have you. And Catholics should pray that he have good judgment. All right. Now, to the idea that a Catholic thinks that the job of the Pope is to hold my particular ideology, I think that's just absurd, right? And for any Catholic to leave the church because the Pope doesn't hold my political ideology is to completely and radically misunderstand the nature of Christian theology, the nature of Christian morality, the job of the Pope, and the vocation of the laity, right? So Pope John Paul II was very good about this. He wasn't good because he held my political ideology. He was good because he was clear at distinguishing the church's moral theology on the one hand from political and economic ideology on the other. And he made the point explicitly, and this is Catholic doctrine, that that the church's moral theology is not left, is not right. In fact, it's not even, it's like comparing apples to oranges. It's not on the spectrum of political ideology at all, because it's not ideology. What do I mean by that? Well, ideology is when you have a very specific theory, usually about the nature of the human person and society, that prescribes a very specific policy or set of policies to constrain social relations and political realities. Okay, that's ideology. And that's not what Catholics do, right? That is not the thing about Catholic. What Catholic teaching is about, here are some fundamental moral principles about the nature of the human person and social relations, but we don't translate them into specific policy pronouncements. Like, we don't have a juridical order derived from revelation that we seek to impose on the larger culture, the way something like Islam does. Right? We don't do that. And recognize that different cultures can take entirely different political forms and economic forms, all of which can be more or less just, meaning that they do a better or worse job reflecting those underlying moral principles. The job of policymakers is to constantly reassess and critically evaluate them to try to bring them in line with the principles of Catholic moral teaching, but never to equate ideology as such with the height of Christian morality. And if you achieved total victory in the political sphere and you're able to impose your vision of the universe on the world politically, you would not save it thereby.
Yeah.
Right? That Christ's kingdom is not of this world, and the victory we seek is of the interior man. We are trying to renovate people's moral sensibility so they come to recognize the dignity of the other, the dignity of life, to grow in humility and virtue and the love of God. And that's not something that can ever be communicated through legislation.
Yeah. Clay, thanks so much for your call from Kansas. Quick question here from Sean on YouTube. He says, who is the mother of James, brother of Jesus? So who is that?
That is Mary, the wife of Clopas.
Okay. Mary, the wife of Clopas. Now you know. Quick one from Simon in Saskatchewan. What did Jesus mean when he said, anyone who says, you fool, is doomed to hellfire?
So, characteristic of Jesus' teaching across all of his pedagogy is he wants people to think, just because you follow the letter of Mosaic legislation, do not think that you have achieved righteousness, right? That what you have to do is embody in your character and your attitude and your disposition a genuine care for the other human being.
Okay.
Right? And so he expresses that with a lot of statements, and this is one of them.
Okay. Couldn't get to the question from Robert on YouTube. Robert, we're going to hold your question over till next week. We'll try to get to it then. Dr. David Anders, thank you so much.
Thank you, Tom, very much.
Glad to be with you today for this live program from the EWTN Catholic Radio Conference. The rest of our programs today will be coming to you from the Hyatt Regency here. That would be Open Line and also Beacon of Truth with Deacon Harold. Also Ave Maria in the afternoon. Catholic Answers Live. Keep it right here on EWTN Radio. On behalf of our fantastic team, both here and at the studios, I'm Tom Price. We will see you next time. Have a great day and God bless.